near the end of October 24th. And then November 28th, we just got confirmed, we're going to be visited by one of Russia's leading journalists, who's coming from Moscow, actually, as part of an American tour he's doing, to sort of talk about what's going on in Russia, but obviously also what's going on with Russian-American relations and perceptions of Trump and so forth with Russia. So I think we'll talk about foreign policy, but we'll also talk about the election and a lot of the controversy around Russia and Trump. But as I said, today we're going to be talking about gay marriage. I wanted to start with a video that's about 5 or 6 minutes long that talks about the victory of the freedom to marry movement. And then we will, I'll introduce our speaker.
We have come a long, long way, and today we celebrate a transformation and a triumph. The freedom to marry nationwide.
Progress on this journey often comes in small increments. Sometimes 2 steps forward, 1 step back, propelled by the persistent effort of dedicated citizens. And sometimes there are days like this, when that slow, steady effort is rewarded with justice that arrives like a thunderbolt.
Within living memory, gay people in America were a despised and oppressed minority. Our love was scorned, not respected.
NBC News found that the majority felt that homosexuality was immoral.
When our loved ones were sick and even dying, our own government could barely care less. Early pioneers had bravely stepped forward to claim the freedom to marry. The country wasn't ready. Their dreams were laughed at, their cases dismissed.
Officials turned him down flat. A marital relationship cannot exist between faggots.
But at the heart of discrimination against gay people was the denial of our love. For our dignity, our equality, our families, we had to fight to see our love respected. We had to claim the freedom to marry.
Even writing my paper in 1983, I believed that our fight for the freedom to marry would be an engine of transformation.
There was resistance and uncertainty, even from within the movement.
A lot of people say that civil unions are the same as civil marriage, but they're absolutely different.
So gay people continued to dream of being able to marry the person they loved. Then, in Hawaii, a tectonic shift.
A Honolulu judge told Hawaii state government it cannot deny a marriage license to gay couples.
Many, many couples stand on the brink of being able to do what every other American takes for granted, exercise the freedom to marry.
But what we won was stripped away in a political attack.
The president signed a bill barring federal recognition of homosexual marriages.
Winning in court was not enough. We needed to build a true campaign that could drive our strategy. We needed to be able to win and defend our wins. We needed to move the country to win nationwide in the Supreme Court. And we did. Along the way, there were painful losses.
Marriage is the most fundamental institution of civilization.
52% of voters supported Proposition 8 to ban gay marriage.
The fact that some people would like to undo our I do makes me very sad.
But we never gave up. We learned, we grew, and we won in court.
By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you
Legally married.
We gave Americans a chance to see families helped and no one hurt.
These couples will finally be treated equally and fairly by their government.
They said we couldn't defend our win, but we stuck it out, and we did.
Today, Massachusetts lawmakers voted to uphold gay marriage.
They said we'd never win in the heartland.
Iowa became the 3rd state to allow same-sex marriage.
They said we'd never get the people behind us.
For the first time, the majority of people support gay marriage.
They said we'd never get Republicans to join Democrats and independents on our side.
Freedom means freedom for everyone.
And they said we'd never get elected officials, a vice president, and the president to come on board.
I think same-sex couples should be able to get that.
Some people said we would never ever win at the ballot, but we learned how to do it. And in 2012, we won 4 out of 4. We convinced the nation that love is love.
People learned that we were their kids and their cousins and their friends. We were human beings like everybody else.
This was our journey, together with a movement of many, a shared strategy we stuck to, a campaign to drive that strategy and spearhead that movement. We learned, we built, we rebounded, we kept going.
This morning, the Supreme Court recognized that the Constitution guarantees marriage equality. As the consequence of the countless small acts of courage of millions of people across decades who stood up, who came out, willing to endure bullying and taunts, and stayed strong, and came to believe in themselves and who they were, and slowly made an entire country realize that love is love. What an extraordinary achievement. What a vindication of the belief that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Those countless, often anonymous heroes, they deserve our thanks. They should be very proud. America should be very proud.
Love won. We all won.
So I have a personal connection to our speaker today. Evan Wolfson and I went to college together.
I think you need to turn off.
I have a personal connection with the speaker today. Evan Wolfson and I went to college together. We were roommates. As he may talk about, he did not come out while he was in college, although he knew he was gay. And it was a very different time. And in our class just before this, Evan was sharing with students how different the times were. And how courageous, but also kind of difficult it was to figure out what a strategy would be to bring us to the point of not only gay marriage, but acceptance of gays and same-sex relationships and transgender relationships. Evan Wolfson is an attorney and a gay rights activist. He's the founder and president of Freedom to Marry, which was founded and then won the battle for same-sex marriage in the US. And in fact, after the Supreme Court decision in 2015, one of the things Evan was able to do was to close down Freedom to Marry because there was a victory there. But then take those lessons around the world, which he's been doing, but also to other activist groups to talk about how the strategy that they use in Freedom to Marry can be applied in other ways. After Evan and I graduated from Yale, he went on to Africa to serve in the Peace Corps, and then went to Harvard Law School. And while at Harvard Law School, wrote the first paper thesis about same-sex marriage. And in 2015, when the Supreme Court ruled in favor of same-sex marriage, Harvard Law School did an exhibit, and there, next to the Supreme Court decision, was Evan Wolfson's paper as a third-year law student. And as he likes to point out, he received a B+. Evan went on to a career as a lawyer that would have been very distinguished. He was a prosecutor in Brooklyn. He worked for the Iran-Contra investigation, which at the time, as some of us recall, was very much like the Mueller investigation, trying to get at the bottom of government unaccountability during the Reagan administration. But he gradually moved forthrightly into gay activism and trying to figure out the right strategy to bring these rights to gay people. He was the lead attorney in the Hawaii gay marriage case. He argued for the Supreme Court in the Boy Scouts case. And because of all these cases that he argued in his activism, was named one of the most influential lawyers in the country, was on various lists of people who have made the world a better place. But also, I think in a way most touching was a few years ago, he and President Obama were at Barnard College in New York, and they were both receiving honorary degrees. And as I've heard the story, Obama, had come out finally in support of same-sex marriage, and Evan went up to him and said, "Thank you." And President Obama shook his hand and said, "No, Evan, thank you." And I think we all deserve Evan, a vote of thanks to Evan for what he's done. It's interesting, we now go back to our college reunions, and very often it's kind of, we're sitting there talking about old stories. How many of our classmates, men and women, come up to us and thank Evan because their son, their daughter, has been able to be married because of the work that Evan did. So I'm pleased to welcome Evan Wilson. And also joining us will be Ted Landsmark, who's the head of the Dukakis Center, and he and I will talk to Ted and I will question Evan a little bit, and then we will open it up to questions. And when it comes to question time, Zach, who most of you have seen running up and down the stairs for the past few weeks, will have a microphone. And so if you'd like to speak, Zach has asked that you catch his eye, raise your hand, and I'll make sure everyone has a chance. Evan, let me start by kind of bringing you right into the present, and talking a little bit about it as you look at the way things are going now. Was there ever a time when you were at Yale that you went out drinking and blacked out with Brett Kavanaugh?
Happily, I can say no.
No. So could you talk a little bit about strategy? I mean, the video talks about that, but again, I think for students here, this is a world that they've always lived in, right? In which gays are more accepted, same-sex marriage is a given. For those of us who are older, it seems like the change happened extremely quickly. But you were on the inside. Could you talk a bit about kind of how this happened and what your thinking was to kind of get us to the point where we are today?
So, well, first of all, let me say, even though you're absolutely right that many people experience the winning the freedom to marry as something that happened quickly, as President Obama, wasn't it nice to hear what a president sounds like? What President Obama said so well in the video is it's many, many, many stumbles and steps forward and so on, and then at the culmination of all this work, it feels like justice comes like a thunderbolt. But of course, justice doesn't come like a thunderbolt. It took more than 4 decades for us to win the freedom to marry. I myself, as you said, worked on this for 32 years. Now, the good news is 32 years, I'm sure you all sounds like an unimaginably long period of time, but I'm still alive and still mostly able to function and so on. So you can do something that takes 32 years and still have a lot of great life to live, and that's good because there's still plenty more left to do. And that, of course, is the other thing I'll just say as a preface, which is that while we have won the freedom to marry and achieved an immense transformation in the place of gay and transgender people in the United States and in many parts of the world, the work is far from over for gay and transgender people, as of course it is far from over for us as Americans on so many fronts. So on the question of strategy, when I talk now one of the happy consequences of winning, particularly winning something that up until 5 minutes before many people thought you could never win, is that once you've won, people want to know, how did you do it? And how can we adapt it now to this work and this work and this work? And so what I'm lucky enough to be able to doing now in the bulk of my time is responding to requests for advice and assistance from, as Jonathan said, from other movements, other causes, and other countries. And not only on LGBT questions and not only on marriage, but on the range of causes that people are working on in the world where we need so much work. And one of the main lessons I try to offer people is that your success can be shaped by attention to what I call the ladder of clarity. And I think one of the key reasons we were so successful in the transformation we worked to achieve is that we did a relatively good job, not perfect, but a relatively good job on this ladder of clarity. So what is the ladder of clarity? The ladder of clarity says, first of all, you should begin with where you want to go. Begin with the top right. Clarity of goal. What is winning? And that means you have to pick something. It can't be everything. It's got to be something. There may be many somethings, and there will always be more somethings, but pick something. What is the goal? What are you trying to achieve, and how will you know when you've won? From clarity of goal comes now clarity of strategy. What will it take to win? What is the pathway for winning? And the more clear you're able to be about what that strategy is, what is needed to achieve the work, the goal, the better you can shape your work and focus on what needs to be focused on and not worry about the things that don't actually really matter. But also B, the more you're able to inspire others to see that this goal is attainable, that this strategy will work, and they can bring their piece to that work, and that will help win. From clarity of strategy comes clarity on the third rung of what I call vehicles, which are the programs, the partnerships, the allies, the resources, the funding, the structures that are needed to achieve the strategy to the goal. And finally, the bottom rung is clarity of action steps. What are you giving people to do? What are you suggesting to people they can do, whether it's individuals or organizations, so they can bring a piece to the work that's needed to drive the strategy to the goal? So strategy, as you can see, is an essential element in my mind of winning. Now, the strategy that we use to win the Freedom to Marry almost certainly will not be the strategy that X movement or Y country might need to apply, because that needs to be shaped by the goal and the circumstances of that particular work or that particular country. So it's not about our strategy was great, so take our strategy, cookie cutter, copy it, and do it. But you have to have a strategy. That's the key lesson. Have a strategy. Think through your strategy, and then communicate that strategy so you can bring others in. I could talk about how we came to the strategy for winning the Freedom to Marry, and that does offer lessons that others might want to adapt, but it's not going to be because there was one secret formula we found that is the magic answer to every struggle.
I mean, could you talk about kind of the legal strategy, but also, this we're talking about the media and the midterms, the kind of, let's call it the popular strategy. In other words, that there was kind of a sort of a legal battle that you had to wage, but was there also kind of a ground game that was important as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So as the video very quickly showed, I was not the first person to think of the idea of gay people getting married. Before me, there were couples in the early 1970s, right in the immediate aftermath of Stonewall, the revolt in New York in 1969 that we usually use as the benchmark for dating the modern gay rights movement. In the immediate aftermath of Stonewall in 1969, couples went to court all across the country seeking the freedom to marry. And by 1972, there had been this first wave of marriage litigation, one of which cases had actually already reached the United States Supreme Court. And in 1972, the United States Supreme Court, like all these other courts, threw those couples out, rubber stamped the discrimination. The courts weren't ready, the country wasn't ready, the conversation hadn't happened. And that was where things stood when 10 years later, in 1983, I wrote my law school thesis, and the basic point of the thesis was to say, we shouldn't take that no for an answer. We should fight for the freedom to marry. And I talked about why we should fight for the freedom to marry and what it would do to be working to win the freedom to marry. But that set the stage for further work and further thinking. And as we began really focusing on, okay, how do we do this? How are we going to win? It became clear that our major challenge was, if we were going to win the freedom to marry by getting the United States Supreme Court to bring the country to national resolution, to bring a nationwide victory, well, the Supreme Court had already said no. So the question we confronted was, what do we need to do to turn that no into a yes, to get the Supreme Court to do right what it had already done wrong? And what we concluded was that while litigation was a central methodology, because that's how you go to the Supreme Court, it wasn't sufficient. And what we needed to focus on was not just winning in the courts of law, but winning in the court of public opinion, creating the climate that would encourage and impel the decision makers, be they politicians, judges, or the justices, to do the right thing. And so we sketched out a strategy reflecting our understanding that we needed to create the climate in which well-timed, well-done litigation could succeed. And the strategy we at Freedom to Marry called the Roadmap to Victory. You saw it very quickly in the video. It talked about working on 3 tracks in order to create the climate that would encourage the Supreme Court to do the right thing when we brought litigation to the court. We were always going to bring litigation to the court, but the question was when to do it and in what climate. And so what we concluded was that by building a critical mass of states, going from 0 states where we have the freedom to marry to some number where we have it for real, on the second track, by building a critical mass of public support, growing public opinion and public support for the freedom to marry from the 26% it was at when I was co-counsel on the Hawaii case, the first case in the world to rule in favor of the freedom to marry, to go from that 26% to some critical mass of majority opinion that would register on the court and encourage the court to understand that they can do this, the public will support it, and that they need to do it. There's public demand for it. So track 1, building a critical mass of states. Track 2, building a critical mass of public support. And on track 3, tackling and ending the federal discrimination that was added on top of the state discrimination we already confronted as we began launching the national conversation. And so by working on these 3 tracks, we believe we could create the climate that would allow litigation to succeed. That was the strategy for winning the freedom to marry. Now, as I said, that will not be the exact strategy for winning X goal or Y goal or Z goal. But elements of this strategy are absolutely applicable to most goals and ought to be considered when it comes to shaping the strategy for any particular given goal. And also the concept, the idea that we came to here of having a multi-track strategy, of really thinking through all the different ways we could move the decision maker we needed to move, enabled us to follow one of my rules of activism, which was never get stuck. Find ways to move forward that will build support here for the work you need to do here. And even if you stumble here, you don't have to worry because you are advancing yourself there. And meanwhile, this and this and this may be happening, but it may not matter at all because it's not what the strategy requires.
Can you talk a bit about persuasion? Because obviously we live in a time now where people feel it's hard to even have a conversation, much less persuade people. This was, back in the day, a very emotional issue. People have very strongly held religious beliefs. I mean, this was not an easy question. How did you persuade people, and are there lessons about how that could apply over other issues today?
Yes, because the strategy said that one of the things we wanted to do was build a majority, and then once we had a majority, we then changed it to grow the majority. That we needed to build a critical mass of support. We knew that where we were, 26%, was not enough. So we knew we had to find some way of changing hearts and minds and building, we believe, a majority in favor of the freedom to marry. So what we decided was, on the one hand, it was important that we not assume that just because somebody is liberal, just because somebody's nice, just because somebody's in your family, for that matter, just because someone's gay, that they necessarily understand why marriage matters. We needed to encourage people to make the case to the people that were there, but hadn't been asked. So number one was don't assume you have people's support, you have their understanding. You need to go out and ask them. You need to find ways, and we need to find ways to encourage the millions of people necessary to go out and have these conversations and bring in that support, solidifying the support that was there for us to grab if we went out and grabbed it. And that also meant, again, don't get stuck. If a given gay person did not support the freedom to marry and just had their own views about why this wasn't important, I would always say to people, well, don't get stuck trying to get every last living gay person. For every gay person, there's 10 non-gay people who you can go out and talk to. Go talk to them. Find people to talk to, but go and talk to them. And the second point, the second idea was really the flip side. Just as we were saying, don't assume that people are there. We also said, don't assume that just because someone isn't there yet, they can't get there. Now, that doesn't mean go out and bang your head on the wall of the most difficult. Start with the easiest, go to the next. If you don't feel comfortable talking to this one, talk to that one, go out and get them. But find ways of reaching people where they are to bring along, bring forward what I call the reachable but not yet reached. People who have not yet been engaged, who maybe started from a place of resistance or ignorance or fear or uncertainty or indifference, but who could be got. Not the hardcore opposition, but the people we could move. And then we deployed, and obviously this all sounds very smooth and linear and perfect, and it took many, many years of stumbles and missed opportunities and lessons having to be learned and then learned again, and things we probably could have done better in the first place. But through a lot of work and a lot of efforts over a lot of time by a lot of people, we're able to figure out how to engage that base and then that reachable middle, the movable middle, and bring them forward. And one of the ways that we were able to do that was that at a certain point in this very, very long and multifaceted, multi-front engagement with people, we had grown that 26% support from 1996 to, by 2010, a fragile majority of 50 to 53%, depending on the polling and the moment. That was enormous progress and a real testament to the power of the conversations, stories, the personal engagement, the way in which people could be prompted to move, the way in which their initial resistance was not hard and fast. And that movement led to this fragile majority. The problem with the fragile majority was it was fragile. So when it was put to a vote, as in California in the infamous Proposition 8, or as in Maine in the following year when it was thrown on the ballot in 2009, that initial 50-ish% majority we had painstakingly built could be peeled away because it wasn't fully solid. So what we concluded was we needed to go beyond the majority we had now laboriously built to a solid majority. And to do that, we really had to look at this question of who are the people we haven't yet gotten or have gotten very flimsily that weren't keeping when the rubber hit the road or when the opposition ads began running. And what we learned in looking really at those people in particular was that the persuasion they needed, what they needed to understand was not the persuasion we were putting forward as effectively as possible. And so we adapted the case we were making, not in an ineffective way, and not in a total way, but in a way that was effective for the people we needed to reach.
What did you do? What did you change?
So from 1996 to 2010, essentially Americans were being bombarded, both from us, from the opponents, and just the national debate and the millions of individual conversations, with a mix of messages, a mix of elements, a mix of stories, some of which talked about personal stories and Mom, I'm gay, I'm in love, etc., and some of which were the Constitution requires equality under the law, and some of which were gay people need the same health coverage and insurance coverage and the same legal protection if they get in an accident as anyone else. A mix of the very authentic and real elements that range from the emotional to the abstract, justice, as well as intangible values of love and family and so on. And that was effective in growing to a majority. But we still were not getting the next set of people we needed. So we dug deep on those people. We essentially had years of experience to draw on as we thought about it. We also conducted focus groups and really looked at it. We crunched 85 data sets to try to crack the code on what do those people, the people who hadn't yet come along, what do they need to hear so we could get the next swath? And what we found was that if you imagine that we had in this focus group of people from whom we have now excluded the gay and the pro-gay, the people who are 100% with us, they were not in the focus group. The people who are the hardcore anti-gay, we hate gays, it's a sin, it's horrible, I'm never gonna be here, we excluded them as well. What we were looking at was the people who wanted to be fair, who weren't deeply anti-gay, but who just would not support freedom. And we asked them, in effect, two questions. The first question was, why did you get married? Why did you want to get married? And the number one answer was love. Exactly, love. 72% love. Then we asked them a second question. The second question is, why do you think gay people want to get married? And the number one answer was, yeah, so the number one answer was, I don't know. They didn't know why gay people wanted to get married. And when pressed, the answer they came up with, 36% came up with, was health insurance. Maybe they want that health insurance. And the problem was, those people, these reachable people, they were mostly willing to give gay people. They thought it was unfair that gay people couldn't have health insurance. But that's not why you get married. So that was the light bulb moment, that they did not understand that gay people, in the exercise of our common humanity, have the same aspiration for love and commitment and joining in family that marriage signified to them. And so it was not a matter of that we had never said that before. It's that was being said along with a variety of other things, which worked for the group that we got to 50%, but wasn't penetrating sufficiently for the people that we needed now to. And so we really recalibrated not only freedom to marry's messaging, but also the messaging being done by our brother and sister organizations, our allies, eventually the media, and soon politicians. And the country essentially shifted from a discourse about the case for the freedom to marry from, if you want to call it, rights and benefits to love and commitment. And as we centered personal stories and the heart and emotion and love and these shared values, we went from 53% in 2010 to, by the time we stood in front of the US Supreme Court for what became the victory in 2015. So in 5 years, we grew that 53% to
63%.
Very good. 63%, exactly. So a very dramatic shift. Now, sometimes what's interesting is that story gets told now as one of the lessons. And the story that people tell is they didn't win until they changed their message and found that what they were doing wasn't working and changed it to. Well, that's not exactly right. It was working for the people we needed to move. But what you always need to be thinking about is who are the people you need to move? What do they need to do? And what may move me, and then you, and then the next one, all well and good, but that may not be what the fourth and the fifth and the 500th and so on need to hear. So that was the work we did. And there's one other important lesson in that, which is I'm talking about the message, but at least equally important, and one of the major challenges in the work, and that we ultimately were able to do well, was not just the message, but message delivery. People always want to talk about and argue about the message. Everybody always wants to fuss about the graphics or the words, and those are, those are important. But it's how you reach people, the messaging, that is at least as important as the message.
So the Supreme Court, you win 2015. You say freedom to marry doesn't have to, the organization doesn't have to exist anymore. 2016 comes. Do you now wake up at 2 in the morning thinking, what happened? I'll start the organization again. We're moving backwards. There's a backlash.
Well, I'm sure like everybody, or almost everybody, I certainly never really got to sleep. A pivotal night in 2016, the worst night I would say of my life, and have had fitful sleep ever since about what happened and where are we as a country and the existential crisis that our country confronts. But not because of the freedom to marry. It's not that I'm sitting there thinking that the freedom to marry is number one on the chopping block or the most likely thing to be targeted. It's more the urgency of all of us as Americans getting our country back on track, not just for gay people, not just for transgender people, not just for marriage, not just for women, not just for Muslims, not just for immigrants, not just for all of the communities and values that are under assault, important as all of these things are, but because it's our country and our Constitution that are in danger. And that's what I really focus on. When I closed Freedom to Marry, the reason I closed Freedom to Marry was that Freedom to Marry was expressly designed as an organization to drive a campaign that was driving a strategy to a goal. And Freedom to Marry, as an organization, didn't do everything. It took a movement of organizations and millions of people and allies and partners and methodologies and so on. It was a multiplicity that delivered the victory as described in the strategy. Freedom to Marry woke up every day focused on the strategy toward that goal of winning marriage and figuring out how to leverage the movement, elevate this piece, applaud that piece, delegate the other piece, and fill in the gaps where somebody wasn't there. Having achieved that goal and driven the strategy to success, the purpose of that structure, that campaign had been achieved. The purpose and goals of the movement were never over. And on the day we won the Freedom to Marry, the culmination for me personally of 32 years and our movement 40 years and many, many people talk about, for me, this represents 32 years of work resulting in victory, actually scored 2 wins on that day, June 26, 2015. Because one, after 32 years, I was successful in winning the Freedom to Marry. And 2, I got an op-ed in the New York Times. Almost as difficult. And with almost as many attempts. And on that day, they felt like they had to run something by me, so they did. And in that op-ed, literally on the very same day we won the Freedom to Marry, I talked about why winning the Freedom to Marry was important, how it had come to be, and moved toward, and here's what's ahead. Here's what we now must do. Here's how we can harness the momentum we've built to the ongoing urgent work still ahead. So the movement's work was never over. And Freedom to Marry, in closing, transferred its assets, its money. Many of our team went to work in other organizations. I myself remain, of course, active and engaged with the many other organizations who are now the ones who have to shape and drive a strategy toward the goals, both defensive and affirmative, that remain. In my mind, goal dictates strategy, and strategy dictates structure. It wasn't about taking the structure we had built to drive the particular strategy to the particular goal and now saying, okay, what can we now do? It was rather about thinking anew about, okay, what is our goal now? What's the strategy and what's the...
But do you feel in the way that the Trump administration seems to be targeting different things at different times, that say gay rights or transgender rights is somewhere on the target field?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, and there are important, wonderful organizations who are our pillar partners and new ones who have come into the work of pushing back against these efforts by the Trump-Pence regime and by hostile courts and by other players in the world who are also driving anti-gay and anti-trans agendas, including many of the autocrats and others who are the problems on a range of things that we care about. They didn't go away. When Freedom to Marry was passed, we gave them our assets and turned that over to them, and we work now together in those iterations. And there may need to be even stronger efforts and stronger strategies to meet the challenges of the day. The challenges are huge and real, both for gay and transgender people and for all of us in the world who believe in liberal democracy, including here at home. This is under assault, and we must find ways of advancing what we believe in. And a piece of my work right now is going to other countries and advising the system.
Could you talk about that? Because you've been to China, which sort of surprised me, and you've been to Latin America, to Europe. Could you talk a little bit about how these are rippling across in surprising ways?
Yeah. Well, human rights are universal, and everybody is entitled to the same human rights, no matter what society, no matter what country they live in. And in many parts of the world, we're seeing tremendous progress on questions of human rights, and in many parts of the world, we're seeing dire situations and regression and rollback. And in much of the world, probably actually fair to say all of the world, it's still a struggle. It's always a struggle, including here in the United States, where we've won the freedom to marry, where we've made so many gains. So what I'm now lucky to be able to do is I'm not in charge of any of these efforts. I'm not leading the fight to win the freedom to marry in China or Panama or Japan or Czech Republic or what have you. But I can work with advocates and people on the ground who want to take these elements, adapt them appropriately to their challenge, their system, and so on, and move forward. And again, it's not only on gay and on marriage that I'm able to try to be helpful. It's here at home and in some other countries on women's rights, gun control. I'm now the pro bono senior advisor to the National Immigration Law Center, working on this movement and struggle here in the United States, which of course has counterparts and similar kinds of questions percolating up in other countries in Europe and so on. So the opportunity to share the experience and lessons and to try to bring people together and help people not have to start from scratch, but to take elements that work, discard the others, and adapt them to their countries is definitely an opportunity. Since winning the freedom to marry in the United States, we've gone on to win in several more countries. Last year, we won in 3 countries. We won in Malta, a deeply Roman Catholic country, in Germany, one of the powerhouse countries of Europe, of course, and the leader of the free world today, and in Australia, a country where we had majority support for decades, but had not been able to translate it into victory. And last year, we did. We won in countries like Colombia and Ireland and Austria. There's a battle now raging in Taiwan, where we are hopefully on the verge of winning the first freedom to marry victory in Asia, but the opposition is working as hard as it can to try to impede that victory using many of the same playbook and tactics they use here for decades in the United States that it took us so long to figure out how to beat. So there are many places of opportunity, and I really want to be clear that on the one hand, winning the freedom to marry and advancing human rights for gay and transgender people and for women and for others, is enormously important. And all of these pieces of work are hugely compelling and necessary, in part because of the people who are affected, and in part because it is only if those of us who live in countries committed to pluralism and the rule of law and human rights and democracy, if we don't live up to those values and make them real, how can we be effective agents of moving the world forward when it comes to other countries that don't have all these advantages and these commitments and so on? So this is really important. At the same time, to me, this is still only one part of the larger and most immediate challenge of figuring out how to defend liberal democracy and pluralism and the rule of law in the United States and in other parts of the world. And while this is one important avenue for that work, there are others as well. And what I hope to do is to see as much of that move forward as we can together, keeping our eyes on the big prize, but with mindful of the fact that no one of us can do everything. So rather than, because you can't do everything, agonizing and doing nothing, it's better to pick something and move forward.
Okay, did you want to?
I would just make one comment that this is really energizing and a very optimistic viewpoint, particularly because the thing that won was the value of love, as opposed to the pragmatics of getting health insurance. And it does suggest that reaching into people's hearts has value, even as all of the other pragmatic concerns are being addressed. But I'd like to hear from the class, actually.
If I just make one comment to what you just said. You know, in this decades-long struggle and multi-methodology, litigation, legislation, public education, direct action, fundraising, electoral, multi-methodology campaign and set of efforts that it took to win, we lost and lost and lost and lost and lost and lost, not just for years, but for decades. There were many, many defeats and losses. We lost and lost and lost in courts, as I described, just to give one example. I told you about that first wave of marriage litigation. We lost in the second wave of marriage litigation 20 years later as well. But that wave of litigation, the Hawaii case, most importantly, launched this ongoing global movement that endured. And we took that work and built on it and continued moving forward. And we still lost and then won and lost and lost and won and won. By the end, however, with the cumulative effect of all this work and all this change and the tenacity it took to move through these losses, by the end, we began winning and winning and winning and winning and winning. The last 2 years was largely a story of winning. We won mostly at least 70 or so court cases in the last 2 years, having lost almost all beforehand. Of all of those court cases, my favorite sentence came in the case in which we won the freedom to marry in Utah, toward the end. And in that ruby red, conservative, religious state, we won the freedom to marry toward the end. And the court wrote this sentence. The court said, "It's not the Constitution that has changed. What has changed is our knowledge, our understanding of what it means to be lesbian or gay." And that sentence captured the entire essence of how we won. Because the Constitution was always there. The principles and the guarantees were always there. They were there when those couples went to court in the 1970s and lost. They were there when I, as a student, wrote my law school thesis and got a B+. They were there when we went to these other courts and lost and lost. The Constitution was there. But what we needed to do was to get the country, the public, the elected officials, judges, the justices to see how the command of the Constitution applied to people whom they had to come to understand. And so as we were able to do that, it changed the context in which we can now deploy, and still needed to deploy, the political and legal and electoral work of bringing home that understanding and turning it into law.
Okay, so we're gonna have Zod start running up and down the stairs. Raise your hand or catch Zod's eye if you have a question.
Thank you for coming and speaking today. I'm wondering how you use journalism and media to kind of perpetuate the strategy of getting the public on your side.
So journalism, the media, et cetera, I think plays a role really in two ways. One is the function, the role that journalists, the media, play as actors themselves, reporting on developments, explaining things to people, making the case, analyzing what's happening, critiquing what's happening, telling stories, and so on. And journalists played a very important role because public education, growing understanding was a huge element, as I said, of the strategy. Media and journalism are also important as a medium by which those of us who are trying to persuade and change people operate. So figuring out how to engage the media, how to use the different media of communication, of persuasion, of storytelling, and developing the resources and sustaining the drumbeat and recruiting the echo chamber of reinforcing messengers who are using the various media available to reach people was very important from our end as well. So in those two ways, I think media and journalists are really important and play a hugely important role, as is the case generally when it comes to democratic engagement, how we move things in a democracy and how we communicate with our fellow citizens, the public, how we tell stories, how we touch hearts, how we persuade, how we reason, how we create a climate around decision makers. In both those ways, they're important. When I was in the class a little earlier, I talked about it also from another way of thinking about it. In the kind of engagement that we needed to do to shift public opinion in order to create that climate around decision makers, on the one hand, we needed to pay attention to what I call air cover, which is the atmosphere, the engagement up here, the news coverage of debates and arguments. When I would go on TV squaring off against one of our opponents, when legislators would make their statements, when Bush would go on TV and say we need to have a constitutional amendment to preserve the sanctity of marriage, when the television ads were run from both sides, all of this kind of discussion up here played an enormously important role in getting people to have to begin thinking about something they hadn't thought about, putting the words gay and marriage in the same sentence, or not. It promoted, it inspired, it generated what I think of as the chief engine of change, which is conversation. It prompted people to have conversations, and it also in many ways helped frame and shape and reverberate those conversations. The millions of individual conversations had this national air cover, as well as in particular local battles, that both prompted them and helped reinforce them or shape them and so on. So there's that whole air cover, and of course media and journalism are essential elements, even structural elements, of a lot of that air cover. But what we also came to understand was that air cover alone is not what's going to win. While conversation is the chief engine of change, we need those conversations to happen in what I think of as the ground game. Those personal conversations, the one-on-one, the millions of conversations that we needed people to have, family member to family member, neighbor to neighbor, fellow citizen to fellow citizen, that would, over time, change people's hearts and minds. And so while media plays an essential role in the ways I just described, it alone is not sufficient. When people sometimes say, oh, well, people saw Will and Grace and they fell in love, so then they voted for gay marriage. I mean, that's just not the way it works. Popular culture, news coverage, media analysis, media storytelling are hugely important in creating that air cover in which the ground game that closes the deal must be mounted and sustained in order to bring the victory home. And then, of course, all of that public opinion then also still needs to be harnessed to the specific political and legal and electoral work that will achieve the change. As we see almost daily now, the public may believe massively one thing by huge majority numbers, but if there isn't the political engagement, whether through the law or legislative work or electoral work, to turn that into power and action, it's not enough. So we had to be conscious of all of these elements as we drove a multifaceted strategy.
Hello. So I guess kind of given what you said and kind of how important media is to kind of the digestion of information and initiating conversation, how would you suggest media kind of goes forward in today's age of just so much tension, I guess, especially from those who leave this country?
So much tension, what was the last thing you said?
Just from those who leave this country and just kind of in general, they seem to have a lot of, they face a lot of challenges, I guess. I have to say something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, you guys all probably know more than I do about some of the structural challenges that the media industry, as it were, is wrestling with right now. And that's a reflection of and connected to other larger shifts in the country, how people socialize, how people communicate with one another or don't, how we get in silos, I mean, all that stuff that you're probably studying and thinking about. So I'm not really an expert in how best to deal with all of those structural challenges. But what I would say is that we see every day still the media performing enormously important and admirably executed delivery of its job, whether it was the New York Times story today about Trump's record of criminality, that will now, as the rest of us, whether media or otherwise, do our work of turning that understanding into political will and action, affect the course of events. So I think there are many great examples of the media doing its job and being courageous and continuing to persevere in the face of the corrupting attacks from those who are not democratic and who wish to crush that kind of coverage and accountability, as well as the underlying economic and industry structures that are also creating challenges for the media.
Let me follow up on that. I mean, do you analytically, putting politics aside, analytically, do you think conservatives have been doing a better job of that over the past 20 or 30 years? The air cover, the ground game, turning ideas into action?
I think that on the right of center side, and it's important to, even though this sounds very linear and very clear, there aren't these, there's not one person who sits in command of an enterprise and 50 years later it produces the result because they commanded a very clear military-like conspiracy that did X, Y, Z. That said, there was a deliberate, intentional strategy driven by key right of center players originating in the business community and evolving. A deliberate strategy of reshaping the national narrative and changing the political and judicial and academic institutions of our society to drive home their views and to give them power. Lewis Powell, later appointed to the US Supreme Court, wrote a memo for the Chamber of Commerce that sketched out a decades-long campaign to infiltrate the academy and to get businesses to devote resources to building lobbying shops and to bring their game to Washington and to foster certain narratives, et cetera, et cetera. This did happen. And when you look at the creation of engines such as Fox and the whole other sort of media outlets that you again probably know more than I do, but Breitbart and others that many of us had not even been aware particularly existed, but were very effective in reaching a segment of the public and wielding power and so on, then you have to say, yeah, that was a very well executed strategy and a very smart investment of a lot of resources and time and effort to build the kinds of structures and campaigns and efforts to promote a particular goal and strategy. And there is not counterpart to that on the left of center if you look at the last 30 years, 40 years, and so on. Not to say there isn't good work, not to say there isn't good philanthropy, not to say there isn't, there haven't been enormous victories, there have. But there hasn't been the same kind of concerted, deliberate, strategic investment in that kind of infrastructural undergird of how you would shape narrative and drive strategy and so on. The good news is, if they did it, so can they. These are tools. These are things that anyone can do if they go out and do them, knowing that it won't happen overnight. It's not easy and it's not linear. And the right of center, for much of the period I'm describing, even though when we look at it today, we can see the fruits of much of their labor, there were many periods during that time when they thought they were the ones who were losing. They were the ones who were not getting what they wanted. And that's the other piece of good news, that even those who don't necessarily have the massive resources or the numbers or the built-in infrastructure of some of the opposition, such as the the gay movement and the freedom to marry, we can still win also. There are ways you can do things, but you have to be strategic and tenacious and mobilize others toward a goal. And the last thing I'll just say on that is that one of the lessons of activism and the lessons of social change is that you don't need everything, you need enough. So it's not about trying to figure out how do we get everyone to drop what they're doing over here and build the left infrastructure for X or focus on the goal Y. That's not the way it works. A critical mass, enough, can achieve tremendous change and can inspire mass change, mass movement. I wasn't telling everybody in America what conversations to have around kitchen tables. No one person, no one organization has that reach and or that depth, even if they can be heard through their coverage, which I couldn't, but even if they could, they don't necessarily have the depth to make it happen. It takes this multiplicity to make that happen. But it's the critical mass that can achieve tremendous shifts and tremendous change if they are strategic and tenacious and bring in others as they go forward.
I have a question. Could you pull back the curtain a little bit at that time when you were defining the goal before strategy and before vehicle, and how you decided to define the goal as to marry versus to gain civil status with all the rights and benefits?
Yeah, so to be clear, there never was a time where every gay person, or for that matter, every gay, or as we later say, LGBT organization agreed on marriage as a goal, let alone the goal. That never happened. If you've ever met a gay set of people, you'll know that they don't agree on anything. So it was never about getting everyone to agree on what the goal should be, let alone the priority, et cetera, et cetera. When I came on the scene, I argued that we should pursue the freedom to marry. We should pursue marriage, both as a goal and as a strategy. I believe it was a goal and a strategy. It was important in its own right. To be denied marriage was to be denied something enormously important that would bring enormous dignity, meaning, security, tangible and intangible protections and responsibilities to a vast number of people in a way that being denied was cruelly unfair and unconstitutional, and argued that there was a pathway for winning and that we should therefore strive to achieve it because it was important. But I also argued that it was not only important as a goal, but as a strategy. My view was that by fighting for the freedom to marry, we would be claiming the vocabulary of marriage, the shared language of love, commitment, family, inclusion, dignity, that would be an engine of transformation for non-gay people, that would change how non-gay people understood who gay people are, and then eventually also trans people. And that would enable us to not only win marriage, but to advance on all fronts. It wouldn't finish the job, but it would advance us more than other strategies. That was my belief. It was not a popular belief amongst the movement and the core group of advocates that I was part of in those early days, my friends and colleagues. We disagreed bitterly over this, and some still disagree with it, though I think history is
But
valuable.
you advocated that prior to the focus groups that you had.
Oh, yeah,
discussed earlier.
yeah. I didn't even know what a focus group was. I was a
Can
student.
you talk about personally how you came to that?
Yeah, so in law school, you had to write a third-year paper. You had to write a thesis. And by the time I got to law school, I had come to terms with, I wouldn't say with being gay, because I always knew I was gay, and I never thought there was anything wrong with me for being gay. I just thought there was something wrong with everyone else, that the way the world treated gay people was wrong. But at the same time, I didn't really know what to do about being gay. So I didn't talk about it, I didn't come out, we didn't talk about it in college. It was only later that I came out to others, as I had to myself, and then began really focusing on what would it mean to build a life as an openly gay person. And so much of that personal journey took place for me, that part took place after college, when I went into the Peace Corps. And I served as a volunteer in a small village, about half an hour off the nearest paved road in West Africa. And it was there, as a 21-year-old, that I first began having sex with men. And I realized as a 21-year-old that of the guys I was having sex with in this small village in the middle of rural Africa, that many of the guys I was having sex with were not gay. They were friendly, they were accommodating, they were curious, they liked me, but it really wasn't for them. We would do it, and I would enjoy it, and they would be, oh, okay, but nothing else. But then some of the other guys I had sex with during those 2 years, I realized actually really in their heart were gay. But because they lived in a society where they didn't have the freedom, it was illegal, they didn't have the cultural idea of how you would build a life as an openly gay person, and they didn't even have a language for it, that they would never be openly gay. They would never be who they truly were. And that taught me a lesson as a 21, 22-year-old, which was that who you are is profoundly shaped by the choices and even the language that your society gives you. So I took that idea as a young person, not an original idea, but it was original to me as a kid, and then came to law school. And at 23, I entered into law school. And the other big thing that happened at that point, now having come back and decided, okay, now I know I'm gay, this is what I want, I'm gonna figure out what my life is gonna be like as an openly gay person. And I began coming out to friends and then to acquaintances and classmates and the public generally. I didn't really mind at that point. And then my family, stages of coming out. And what happened then was I read the book that changed my life. And that book was by a Yale professor named John Boswell called Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality. And Boswell, in this award-winning, massive tome, traced the first 4,000 years or so of Western civilization and how it had treated gay people and homosexuality. The book is written in like 16 different languages and thousands of footnotes. And I wrapped it in a fake cover and took it down to the beach in Florida to my grandparents one Christmas break, one holiday break, and read it on the beach, devouring it, because history had always been my great passion and love, and I just completely was transformed by this book. And the major insight that I took from his survey was that things had not always been the same. Different societies, contrary to the way we have experienced and thought about it in the West today, in the United States of the 1980s, had treated gay people and homosexuality in all kinds of different ways and had understood gay people and homosexuality in all kinds of different ways. And I said to myself, if it had once been different, it could be different again. So when it came time to write this thesis, I decided, okay, I want to write on how we are going to make things different, how we are going to change this America of the 1980s and its oppression and exclusion and discrimination and stigma around gay people. And so I asked myself, what is the source? What is the main way in which that stigma and oppression, et cetera, play out? And I concluded it's because of who we love. It is against us because of who we love. We love, in people's eyes, the wrong people. And then I thought, well, what is the chief language, the preeminent language of love? It's marriage. Marriage is the language of love in this society and in virtually every other human society that's ever existed. Although marriage has been wildly different, there's almost always been something that's been marriage. And it has been the pinnacle, the signifier, the chief terrain, the language of love and family. And so I felt that by claiming this language, we would transform society. And that's why I decided to write about marriage. Both because it was important in its own right, but because it was going to be this engine of change.
Hi. So first, as a queer person from Mississippi who hopes to one day be married, I want to say personally thank you. My question is, although the queer community is a beautiful community, it's extremely problematic in a lot of ways. Very regressive and oppressive in my opinion, particularly to Black and brown people. It's a lot of body shaming, transphobia is really real in the community. So how did you get people who personally felt ostracized by their community to buy into a community movement? Because I just think that that's interesting on all levels. As a person who has experienced those things, like what I would feel back then and how I felt as I watched things unfold, growing up. So yeah, how did you get those people who personally felt ostracized by their community to buy into this community movement?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one answer in a way is I didn't get all of them. I mean, there are many people who have, as you well know, diverse opinions in pretty much almost any category of our communities. I would literally have the experience of, in the same day, going and talking to a group of people to urge that we need to be ready to fight for the freedom to marry. We need to be making the case outside the court, even as I and my non-gay co-counsel were making the case in court. This was coming, it was a battle. And in the morning, I might speak to a group who would say to me, this is only something that privileged white men care about. This is not something important to us. And then later in the day, I'd go and talk to another group, and they would say, this only affects women who want to have kids. This only affects lesbians who want to get married. Why is it important to us? We can find ways around this. So my experience was that I needed to look past the category, as it were, and make the case, knowing that I was not going to find everyone, and the ones that I didn't get, with some degree of persuasion and patience and persistence. But as I said earlier, don't get stuck. Focus on the ones you can get, and don't hold yourself back because you can't get this one and this one because there's still that one and that one and that one. So it was partly that philosophy that led me to, this will sound very idealized, not worry about not getting everybody, because I didn't think we needed to get everybody. We needed to get the ones we could get. I also felt that it's important not to take people's initial bad response for an answer. For example, I would often be told that, why are you focusing on marriage? What we need to work on is, and now pick your thing. But what people would often say something like, particularly in this crucible decade of fighting against the horror of AIDS, we need to fight on the life or death questions that people with AIDS confront. Or they might take the version that you were intimating, why do we need to fight for marriage? Why don't we just ask for all the benefits, etc. I mean, these were endless questions and arguments that would come up. And I would try to make my case, which was that nothing we could win is going to be, no one thing we win is going to be everything. There will always be more things we need to fight for. We're not going to be done, no matter how big a victory we win. But at the same time, I would try to show people that winning marriage was important to everybody who wanted that freedom to marry, but it was particularly important to people who are poor, people who are ill, people who are immigrants, people who are struggling, etc., because more than any one other thing, it would bring a bundle of meanings and protections that would make a difference to the most vulnerable. But not everybody, agreed with that. But as that became something that we were able to put out there, it did help move, many people who hadn't previously moved before. So I feel like, on the one hand, what I would say to your question is, don't write people off, don't give up, don't assume just because someone's category X or bad today, resistant day, they can't move. But also, don't expect everyone to move, and don't get hung up on the ones that aren't moving. Find the ones that do. The other answer I would give to your question is, what I found was that, as I had described earlier, in the initial, when I left law school, having written this paper, I moved to New York. I began my day job as a prosecutor, and at night I began volunteering for one of the small beleaguered organizations in our small beleaguered movement, Land Legal, and I would go home and write on yellow legal pads, because we didn't have computers then, briefs that, because I was a young attorney and there were very few others, were going to the Supreme Court, were going to these cases, these very big cases, far beyond what a young kid out of law school should have been doing. And I was doing this and arguing with people and engaging with them at the time. And I would like to say that it was my years of tenacious, persistent, patience of a saint arguing and the brilliance of my paper from 1983 that changed everyone's hearts and minds in our movement and led everyone to see how right I was. But that's not, of course, exactly what happened. What happened was, after pretty much a decade of these kinds of arguments and persuasion and getting some support here and making the case and trying to get people used to it and so on and so on and so on, we won a court ruling brought by couples who knew none of this in Hawaii, but who wanted to get married. And that May 5th, 1993, 10 years after I wrote my paper, Hawaii Supreme Court ruling was, as I said at the time, the tectonic shift. And no matter what you had argued before, no matter what you thought before, we were now going to have a chance to go before America and make the case for the freedom of marriage. And we needed to rise to this moment. And now many of the organizations and people who had resisted and argued before, not all, but many, saw that something had changed and this was the opportunity. And because I had worked and labored and laid the groundwork and had some credibility and certainly experience and the honing of the argument through these decades of seemingly fruitless struggle, I was well positioned now to seize that moment presented by an opportunity and begin, in a sense, anew the effort to build the campaign that ultimately led to a mere, whatever we are now in the story, a mere 22 years later, the freedom to marry. So, you may take from that story, yikes, that sounds terrible. Or you can take from the story where you can find the hope and the validation that you can make a difference, though it may not ever feel easy.
Thank you. Two questions. Your country of service with the Peace Corps is one. And two is, can you comment on certain business owners that have filed lawsuits to allow them not to serve people because of religious beliefs? And I'm thinking about the wedding cake, not too far back.
So the first one, I can be brief.
This is a class that has to go back, you're not looking at it.
Okay, good.
It's not that they don't like it.
Yeah, exactly. So I served in Togo in West Africa. And on the question of the so-called religious exemptions, the cake shop, etc., it's important to understand that one of the classic patterns of American civil rights struggle is that there's tremendous opposition to a civil rights advance, and it can take decades, if not centuries, to achieve a civil rights, a human rights victory. And then once we've achieved that victory and moved things forward, the opposition doesn't just vanish. The resistance doesn't go away. Not everybody embraces it right away. There often will remain significant opposition who, having failed to stop the advance, now try to subvert it. And one of the typical, common, familiar, historically repeated tactics that the opponents of civil rights advance use is to try to carve out exemptions from the law that they had, up until 5 minutes earlier, said shouldn't exist in the first place. And one of the most common ways in which they try to advocate for that exemption, that I don't want to, that license to discriminate, is under the banner of religious freedom. They claim they should have a religious freedom to not follow the law. This we saw in the 50s and the 60s and on in the African American and Latino Americans and Asian American civil rights struggles. We saw it in the 70s and the 80s as the women's movement began racking up legal victories and legal gains. We see it today with gay people and transgender. Gay people and transgender people are not the first people to be targeted with this religious carve-out license to discriminate tactic. There's a long history of this, and we mostly have won those battles, but not every single time. And this is where we are right now. Having made this enormous transformative progress, the opposition has not vanished. They are resorting to this very familiar historical tactic. compounded by the very challenging and politically dysfunctional situation in the country right now, where many of the legislatures and the executive branch, and thus many of the judges, do not reflect what the American people believe. So there will be these wins and losses on this terrain, as there has always been and continues to be in civil rights generally. But we will win. We will make the case. We will not win every battle, but we will win. Because ultimately, in a democracy such as ours, everybody's freedom, everybody's ability to work together and build together and thrive together in the community is advanced when we say that everyone's free to believe what they want, everyone's free to teach what they want, everyone's free to preach what they want, they're free to conduct themselves in their own lives. But when you enter the marketplace, when you hold yourself out as a business as open to the public, you must serve the public.
While the mic is being circulated, could you talk about whatever was most frustrating to you through this process?
Sure. So when people ask me a version of the question, they'll say, what was the hardest part? And the hardest part was, of course, moving the public, moving millions of public and the legal and political edifices that are connected to that public in our democratic republic. That was the hard part. But that's the work. That doesn't, to me at least, take the same toll. That's just the work you do. And in some ways, there's a joy in making a difference and engaging and seeing progress, however slow. The most frustrating part was the timidity or resistance or objections from those on my side, not the opponents. It didn't bother me to go on TV and have, I won't name names, but having various political players saying all kinds of horrible, inane, bigoted things. To me, that was the work. And I wasn't talking to them, I was talking to the audience. But when I would have to fight with my own friends, fight with my own organizations, fight with our political allies who weren't showing enough courage, so that was the most frustrating, because they're the ones who really push your buttons. They're the ones who you feel that frustration. And I took consolation and encouragement from the fact that this too is not a new experience. This is the pattern of civil rights advance. Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail is not written to the opponents. It is written to the allies, the moderates, the so-called moderates, those who were on his side generally, but who were saying, can't you go slower? Can't you not push? Why not? Why rock the boat? All that stuff. That's the most frustrating part.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It's really humbling. Just segue onto that, I want to ask about future initiatives, specifically dealing with what activism encounters frequently today, intersectionality, and building coalitions of similarly affiliated groups. I can't help but see a lot of organizations in the forefront of these fights, like the HRC, being the moderates right now. Can you speak a little bit to your perspective of what queer activism looks like in the future and how it can overlap with other similarly affiliated initiatives?
So when you began the question, I was going to make this point, but then I thought I heard a different question there, so I'll see if I can remember to get to the second thing. But so the first thing I wanted to say is that one of the things I've been very proud of our movement, the broader lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender movement and allies over the last couple of years, is the way in which our movement organizations have very much stood in solidarity and on the front lines with many of the other communities and values who've been under assault. Immigrants, Muslims, through the list, women, and vice versa. I think there's been a recognition generally, not obviously with every person at every moment, but generally I think there's been a recognition amongst many that we are at a time of crisis and we have to find solidarity and find ways to work together and be there for each other and stand up for our shared values without getting hung up on all the millions of differences in academic classifications with which we can otherwise torture ourselves. And by and large, our movement, I think, has performed very well in that way in the last couple of years, and as have others. So that was what I first thought, that I prefer to focus on what has worked, what has been good, what will bring people together, how can we move forward, and try to not divide ourselves with the endless ways in which we can impede that 90%, because somebody's not 100%. When you then brought up the example of other organizations within our movement, that to me is a slightly different question. And what I see there, now I'm going to somewhat repeat myself, which is that no one organization will do everything. And there will never be a time when every person or every organization within a given movement will agree on goal, strategy, approach, priority, etc. There never was in marriage. Even some organizations that gave lip service to fighting for the freedom to marry at times where it seemed compelling or exciting, or when they were feeling a grassroots demand for it that had been created despite their thinking, even they may have given lip service or may have actually contributed in parts, but were never did not bring the same commitment, the same sustained focus to be there during the hard times or the long haul challenges. They were there when it suited their purpose, intentionally or otherwise, to be there. That was frustrating, but it was not something I really spent the bulk of my time focused on, because it won't help, it won't change to just be banging your head on the wall of why somebody else is not doing what you think they should do. It's much better to focus on the parts you can control, the parts you can engage, and find a way to get a critical mass of people to come along, including those who come along for their own purposes in their own ways at their own time. So that's one point. The second point is that there are also different kinds of organizations. Organizations like HRC, which you mentioned, and many others.
What is HRC?
Yeah, the Human Rights Campaign. It's one of the largest organizations in the LGBT movement. It's primarily a Washington-centered organization, but it has a pretty strong presence in many states, and generally it has a very effective branding and marketing component. It's out there. It's very attentive to its image in the media and to fundraising. There are organizations that are, let's just say, let's call them institutions. So you can infer some snarkiness or negativity in what I just said, but there are other organizations with whom I work extremely closely who I regard as the pillars of our movement, like Lambda Legal or the ACLU's Lesbian Gay Rights Project, Lesbian Gay Bisexual and Transgender Rights Project, National Center for Lesbian Rights. Of course, here in Massachusetts, you have one of the crown jewels, GLAAD, the Gay and Lesbian Advocates and Defenders. These are the 4 legal groups. These are pillar organizations, and they exist to advance the broader cause of the movement, not just with regard to this goal or this goal or this goal or this goal. So they worked and were hugely crucial players and partners on winning marriage, but at the same time, they also work on transgender rights and safe schools, and go right down the list of the many things we need to win and care about. They are institutions. They serve multiple constituencies on multiple questions over multiple times, multiple years, and their mission will probably never be done. Freedom to marry was consciously created as a very different kind of thing. Freedom to marry, from the get-go, was not an institution. Freedom to marry was a campaign. It was built to drive a strategy to a goal. It was built to leverage the movement and to expand the movement necessary to the achievement of a particular goal. That gave me, on the one hand, the advantage of focus and also the responsibility to be there during the hard times and the times of rallying people, as well as the times where we could fundraise and easily rally. It was a different kind of thing. But it also was something I was able to do because I could pull in some of those institutional players, those multi-front players who were there. So when I created Freedom to Marry, for example, even though I had been co-counsel on the world's first Victories for the Freedom to Marry and had worked on many other cases and advised others and am technically a lawyer, from the get-go I said Freedom to Marry will not litigate, even though litigation was a central element of the strategy, because I could count on these 4 pillar organizations and then, of course, many, many others who came into the litigation space as we began winning. I could count on them to deliver that part. I could focus on the everything else. So I think there are comparative strengths to those different kinds of organizations, and one can do critiques of some of the different kinds of organizations and the way they implement and execute their role and the way they think strategically or don't, the way they act tenaciously or don't. But it is also true that it takes both of those, in my mind, to succeed.
Let me just broaden things out just a little bit in terms of the midterms, which are coming up. And again, politically, you've been very active. You talk to a lot of people. You've seen what change and success can look like. What do you anticipate is going to happen in November? What do you fear could happen in November and afterwards? You could maybe kind of give us your sense of both the midterms and 2020. What are the pitfalls as well as the possibilities?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first and most important thing I can say is everyone in this room who is legally allowed to must vote and must really take seriously our need to contact everyone we can contact, and not just here in Massachusetts, to make sure they're quickly, and like really quickly, registered to vote, that they have a plan to turn out to vote, that they do turn out to vote, that they're connected, and that they know how to vote. Do not take that for granted. It is so urgent. We see what a handful of votes can do to history. So we must take seriously our responsibility to vote and to get others to vote. And by the way, here in Massachusetts, a very important measure on the ballot is, I think it's measure 3, right? Which is a measure aimed at rolling back the protections that the state has enacted and carried out without any problems or difficulty for ensuring that transgender people can access places of public accommodation, such as restaurants, stores, theaters, bathrooms, and so on. For 2 years, this law has been functioning very well, but the ideological opponents have not stopped, and they have a measure on the ballot here in Massachusetts aimed at taking that away. Everyone has to vote yes to keep that law in place and not take it away, and to make sure that friends and family, others here in Massachusetts, voters here in Massachusetts, know about this measure. So the number one most important message is don't spend all your time thinking and worrying about all the terrible things that might happen and the way this might go, because that is immobilizing. Focus on what you can do. And the number one thing you can do is vote and make sure others vote and that they know how to vote and that they turn out and vote on November 6th. My general philosophy is don't wallow in the negative. Don't spend your time cataloging all the bad things. It's bad enough already. Don't make a bad thing worse. Don't make a bad thing worse. Focus on what you can do to get what you want, the pathway, not the problem. Having said that, I believe that how America votes in this midterm is going to be a crucial, possibly existential turning point in history. If we do not take back at least one house of Congress and provide some kind of check on this regime, we as a country, let alone all the different causes and communities and values, are in terrible, terrible peril. And that hinges on us. Ultimately, where the media has done its part, and where the courts have somewhat done their part, and where Congress has by and large failed to do its part, it is the people, the voters, who still, so far, have the ability to put the country on the right track. And this is the moment where we have to do that. And so, I could talk about how afraid I am that it might go wrong, but I don't think that's that productive. It's bad enough already. Focus on, we have to make this happen. And we won't be done, even if we take back both houses of Congress. We will still have a huge amount of work to do. We won't be done even when we get rid of this regime that has been foisted on the American people by foreign interference. We will still have a huge amount of work to do. And there are organizations like Protect Democracy and others who have sketched out what an agenda of reconstruction, of renewal, of reinvigoration of our democracy would look like, ranging from the very specific and immediate to some deeper structural work that we have to do, including reinvigorating our American shared understanding of our values and of government as an instrument of collective good and of commitment to pluralism and so on. There's a lot of work we have to do, but rather than being worried about every single part of everything, let's focus on the first thing we need to do, which is win some significant victories on November 6th.
But do you think the Democrats get it? Not do you want them to get it, do you think they get it?
You know, look, who are the Democrats? It's easy to talk about the Democrats as politician X or party official Y or so on, but those of us who are Democrats are the Democrats. And if we're not registered as Democrats because of our sense of purity or our disdain or our disappointment or so on, then what are we doing to actually solve the problem? So again, I don't think of it in those ways. I think of it, if you don't want something to be the way it is, what can you do to change it? And the first thing you can do is owning your own ability to make a difference and then inspiring others to join you. We are the Democrats. And by and large, I think the Democrats get it in the sense of having the right values and the right vision of the country. They have not yet achieved what they need to achieve to propound and deliver on that vision politically in the country. But now's our time to do that. If you measured whether then one would have said the Republicans get it in turn of the century America, when there was another wave of horrible anti-immigrant hostility, record at the time, income inequality, civil rights abuses, et cetera. And it took a Teddy Roosevelt and then a Woodrow Wilson, imperfectly, very effective on certain progressive goals, very badly on race, to bring that vision of moving America forward to the Democrats. If you had measured that question in 1900, you would have said no. If you were looking at it in 1908, it had moved, it had changed. Same thing with the Democrats, where the Democrats were in 1928 and 1930 versus where they were starting with FDR and the New Deal and what built the most successful embodiment of American values for the next 40 years until they got tired, they lost their vision, it shifted. The right of center pushback and effort to change that narrative was sustained and focused and delivered Reagan and everything that has followed since, except for the points in which we were winning with Obama and so on. So I don't look at it as, oh, we can blame someone else or we have to feel passive. To the contrary, we have to feel engaged. And yes, no one of us is going to change everything. Obama didn't change everything. FDR didn't change everything. But we can change it.
I always have to say this, politically we couldn't disagree more, but I admire you as an individual and what you've accomplished in your life.
Thank you.
I'd like you to compare and contrast the marriage equality effort with Roe versus Wade. My impression is, having lived through that era, that the preparation for Roe versus Wade in terms of democratic appeals and creating a majority for the Supreme Court decision that followed was absent. And the 45 years since Roe versus Wade have seen continual resistance to the decision. My impression is that the freedom to marry is not under assault and will not be under assault because the Supreme Court was essentially endorsing what you had done. That's question number one. Question number two is...
But let's do that one first.
Okay.
I can only remember so many things. So yes and no. I would say that it is the last thing you said is completely true. We did not win the freedom to marry as a gift from the Supreme Court or a bolt from the blue. We wanted, as I described, having won in the court of opinion, change hearts and minds, the law followed. Now, it takes political and legal effort to make that happen, including who appoints which judges sitting where when. So they're not disconnected. But it wasn't a purely give us a gift, thank you very much kind of situation. With Roe v. Wade, the picture is actually a little more complicated than you described. There were tremendous battles and tremendous debate, including in legislatures, but also in the public arena, over abortion, leading up to Roe v. Wade. And public opinion largely favored women's freedom to choose, what we would call it today, or abortion rights, or so on. When Roe v. Wade was handed down by the Supreme Court, it was, as you probably know, 7-2, including Republican appointees and conservative judges. And the public was significantly majority in favor of the ruling. The actual pushback and the campaign to undo Roe v. Wade and to exploit abortion was a political decision made by some activists who'd always opposed abortion, particularly at that point in the Catholic Church hierarchy, though a majority of Catholics favored and still do favor the freedom to marry, but the hierarchy was against it, and they had been against it before. And they found partners now in particularly Republican Party political operatives who, through deliberate political work, transformed the position of the Republican Party on this question, made it a partisan tool for organizing with effect for their cause, and changed the narrative and the political and legal momentum around the question. That came actually several years after Roe v. Wade. There was not an immediate, contrary to the way people sometimes, immediate reaction of horror and, oh wow, this went too far. That's not at all what happened. The public was generally supportive and bipartisanly in favor. It took about 8 years for that political shift that I just described, engineered, to happen. And the other piece of the story that I think is important is that those of us who, again, have a very different view, who were on the winning side of Roe v. Wade, I think to some extent dropped the ball, not fully appreciate not just the power of the win, but also the limits of the win and the need to continue the engagement, and that while the struggle had advanced, it wasn't over. And I think that combination of a new and partisan, ascendant and tenacious and well-executed strategy on the one side, with a failed opportunity and a missed opportunity for many years on the side that I actually favor, is what shaped the story we have today. And one of the things that happens with history and with narrative, and you as people in media and journalism need to think about, is what happens for real is important, but also people's understanding or misunderstanding of what happens. The writing of a story, the writing of a narrative also has power and effect. And generally speaking, I would say my side, the reproductive rights side, the women's empowerment side, dropped the ball, whereas the other side very effectively, not in some conspiratorial way, though there was some conspiring, but it's not all that, very effectively drove a multi-methodology, multi-year, multi-decade effort that not only changed the legal and political situation, but and was also, by the way, coupled to that larger goal of shifting the courts and shifting the political dynamics that Lewis Powell and others described Powell being in favor of abortion rights. He wasn't doing it for that reason, but this became a tool that others could use, coupled with the infrastructure that he helped inspire. All of that not only changed the legal and political situation that we're in today, but also rewrote the history. And as new generations came in, they didn't know and never got to hear a lot of the case that had built that majority understanding and shaped people's consciousness in a way. They came in with this notion that Roe v. Wade was a terrible decision, was an overreach, and even if you favor it, it was reckless, and didn't drive home with tenacity what the world would have looked like had Roe not happened and had we not continued to advance abortion rights. And so now we're fighting kind of a rear guard effort to not only change the politics and the law, but to actually also reinvigorate people's understanding of why this freedom is so important.
Second question is anybody attempting to amass actual data on gay marriage? How many gay people, how many transgender are marrying? Do they have families? The question that I have, which will take years to determine, is whether, in fact, this is an enormous advance in kind of the normalization of all kinds of human behavior, and that in some ways gay marriage may, in fact, improve society relative to the catastrophe that heterosexual marriage sometimes involves.
So the short answer to that question is, well, first of all, there are organizations that make the effort to do the best they can to calculate some of the numbers and measure the effects that you're talking about. The Williams Institute, for example, at UCLA, has done its best to extrapolate from the dispersed data, because remember, there's no central registry of marriage in this country. Marriage is regulated by the states, and you don't always know who a same-sex couple is. Pat and Chris. But they have done their best to calculate and estimate using the imperfect data that exists, including the very limited and imperfect census data that exists. And they have calculated that more than 1 million gay people have gotten married in the United States. Nobody has pointed to any ill effects in any respect, though one could say, well, okay, but it's only been, pick your number. Nor has anybody shown any such record of ill effects in any other country. There are now 25 countries in the world where gay people share in the freedom to marry, representing 1.1 billion people, give or take, who now have the freedom to marry, up from 0 when we started. But that's still only 15%, so there's still a way to go. But the other point I would make is that part of the reason there isn't all the kind of data one might want is that the other side, the opposition, including now the Trump-Pence regime, try to block any kind of meaningful collection of data. They are trying to forbid the census from collecting data on same-sex couples and their households and so on. We are the ones who are saying, no, this should be counted. So does that prove 100% what your question may or may not be aiming toward? No, but it is kind of telling, I think, that those who favor the freedom to marry are the ones calling for more data and more measuring and more collection and more analysis, and those who oppose gay people and the freedom to marry are the ones trying to block any collection.
I think you have time for one more question.
Hey, so I had a question. You were speaking earlier about the language of marriage in society and how society uses marriage as the language of love, how that was such a driving force behind the success you had in your campaign. And I was wondering if you could speak to maybe the similarities or differences you see in the way society uses language to identify us, and specifically how pronouns are connected to how we identify ourselves and how society identifies us independently of that.
So I think there's no question that the fact that English, unlike some languages, though, like most languages, is gendered, and that gendering is binary, does reinforce as well as reflect people's general understanding of how sex is structured, male, female, a binary, etc. So on just the basic level, I think that is undeniable. Now, what you do about that, or what that means as far as moving forward, I think people will begin to disagree on. That's kind of the short answer. In general, I think the conversation around pronouns can be useful in that, number one, it can help create space and be true to how some people experience their sex and or gender. And it is useful for us all to be aware of that and to think about that and to try to be respectful and supportive. Whether it is a necessity that everyone stop saying things the way they generally experience things, even if they then try to do it respectfully, and go to a whole other way of shaping the language, let alone the understanding, I think is a different question. That becomes a question of priorities, strategy, ways of reaching people or not reaching people that are most effective, and whether one can get bogged down in a very intense, difficult struggle on something that is here when there may be many other things that could happen either first or instead, that might still achieve a lot of the progress without having to do the lift connected to that particular question. That's kind of a short answer. Is that addressing what you're asking about? Yeah.
Okay, well, Evan, thank you so much for coming. It was really.
I really want to thank all of you, particularly those of you who are here in the School of Journalism and working in media, because as I said earlier, you are an enormously important part of what makes this country as we want it to be, a free country, a constitutional republic, a country in which we have civil society and pluralism and can appeal to reason as well as emotion to create the world we want. Journalism, media play enormously important parts. So stick with it, do it well, keep doing it, and vote on November 6th.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.